The room was alive with a low murmur of voices as neighbors, families, and curious minds filled the modest community center in Lexington, Kentucky. It wasn't a grand venue, just a multi-purpose hall with plain white walls and a slightly faded wooden stage. The folding chairs were packed tight, each row filled with people eager to catch a glimpse of the man they had only seen on TV or heard about through the news. A few kids fidgeted in their seats, and an elderly couple at the back whispered quietly, their hands intertwined. This wasn't the kind of event that drew cameras or journalists. It was a town hall, raw, personal, unfiltered. The kind where people came not for spectacle but for answers. The president, now retired, sat on the stage with a relaxed demeanor, dressed in a navy blazer and an open-collared shirt. The weight of his years in office seemed lighter now, but the lines around his eyes hinted at the stories he carried. The evening had been routine so far, almost predictable. Questions about local issues, national policies, and the state of the economy had filled the first hour. His answers were thoughtful but careful, the kind of practiced responses that didn't stir much emotion. The audience clapped politely, but the energy in the room felt subdued, as if everyone were waiting for something more. Then it happened. From the middle of the crowd, a small hand shot up. First, no one noticed. The president scanned the room, nodding toward a man who had begun to rise to ask his question. But before the man could speak, a voice interrupted. A soft, high-pitched voice that didn't belong to any of the adults in the room. "Excuse me, Mr. President." Heads turned, and the murmur of voices quieted instantly. Standing there, barely tall enough to reach the microphone, was a boy no older than 10. His round glasses slid down his nose as he clutched a small index card in one hand, his other hand nervously tugging at the hem of his sweater. The president smiled, motioning for the boy to step forward. "Go ahead, son," he said, his voice kind and inviting. The boy hesitated, his sneakers scuffing against the floor as he approached the microphone stand. His mother sat a few rows back, her hands clasped tightly together, her face a mixture of pride and apprehension. The boy took a deep breath, lifting the index card to his face before lowering it again. I have a question," he said, his voice trembling but audible. "What does God mean to you?" The air in the room shifted. Conversations ceased. Even the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade into silence. It was as if the question had caught everyone off guard, including the president. For a moment, he didn't answer. His expression softened, his gaze fixed on the boy as if he were seeing something more than just a curious child. The room felt heavier, charged with an energy that no one had anticipated. And then he spoke. "That's a big question," he said, his voice steady but thoughtful. "But it's an important one. Let me tell you what God means to me." But answers to questions like these don't come from a script. They come from the deepest parts of who we are. As he began to speak, the audience knew they were about to hear something unforgettable. The boy's question seemed to ripple through the room, silencing even the faintest whispers. It wasn't the type of question anyone had prepared for. People had expected to hear about policies, national debates, or perhaps even light-hearted anecdotes from the president's time in office. But this was different. It was raw, personal, and deeply human. The president sat back in his chair, the creak of the wooden stage barely audible in the stillness. His hands, which had gestured with ease during earlier questions, rested on his lap now, fingers intertwined as he took a moment to absorb the weight of what had been asked. He looked out over the room, scanning the faces that now mirrored a range of emotions. Curiosity, anticipation, even discomfort. The boy's mother, seated near the middle of the audience, leaned slightly forward in her chair, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something but stopped herself. Instead, she clasped her hands tightly together, her knuckles turning white. She hadn't expected him to actually ask his question. Not in front of all these people. But there he was, standing tall despite the nervous tremor in his hands. An older woman in the front row adjusted her scarf, leaning toward her husband to whisper, "Did you hear that?" He nodded silently, his eyes fixed on the boy at the microphone. A teenage girl sitting near the back of the room pulled out her phone. Not to scroll, but to record. This wasn't something you saw every day. The boy's small frame seemed even smaller under the bright fluorescent lights. The microphone stand had been lowered hastily by one of the event volunteers, but it was still a little too high for him. He tilted his head up, his round glasses catching the glare of the lights, and pushed them up his nose with a shaky finger. The president finally leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He studied the boy for a moment, his expression soft but unreadable. For a man who had faced world leaders, navigated international crises, and weathered countless interviews, this moment seemed to carry a unique weight. "You asked what God means to me," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "That's a big question. Maybe the biggest one there is." He smiled faintly, though it wasn't the kind of polished smile people were used to seeing. This one was genuine, almost wistful. The boy didn't move, his small hands gripping the edges of the podium for support. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded slightly, his gaze fixed on the president as though trying to absorb every word. The silence in the room was palpable. It wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was expectant, like the quiet before the first note of a symphony. The audience leaned forward in their seats, drawn into the gravity of the moment. The president exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing as he prepared to speak. "You know, when I was about your age, I had questions like that too," he began, his voice steady but tinged with something deeper. Nostalgia, perhaps. But stories like this don't just answer questions. They pull you into a journey, one that makes you see the world a little differently, and the audience was ready to listen. The boy's hands tightened around the edges of the microphone stand, his knuckles pale against his small, trembling fingers. His round glasses slipped down his nose again, and this time he didn't push them up. Instead, he kept his eyes on the man before him, searching his face for some sign of understanding. The president shifted in his chair, leaning forward as though to close the distance between them. "That's a big question," he repeated, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. "What does God mean to me?" The audience seemed frozen in time, each person caught in their own thoughts as they waited for him to continue. An older man in the back crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his face unreadable but his eyes locked on the stage. A young woman near the front dabbed her eyes with a tissue, as if the weight of the question alone had struck something deep within her. The president let the silence linger for a moment longer, as though gathering the strength to delve into a part of himself he didn't often share. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I think, to answer that, I need to tell you a story," he began, his gaze softening as it rested on the boy. "When I was your age, I didn't think much about God. My family wasn't very religious. We'd go to church on Easter or Christmas, but it wasn't something we talked about at home. Faith was something I thought belonged to other people, not to me." The boy tilted his head slightly, his expression curious but hesitant, as if unsure what to make of the president's admission. "But then something happened that changed the way I saw the world," the president continued. "I was about 12 years old when I lost someone very important to me. My grandmother." His voice caught slightly on the last word, and he paused to clear his throat. "She was the rock of our family," he said, his eyes briefly glancing toward the ceiling as if searching for her presence. "She wasn't just my grandmother. She was my teacher, my guide, my safe place. When she passed, it felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. I didn't know what to believe in anymore. I didn't even know how to grieve." The boy's mother, seated a few rows back, inhaled sharply, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. Her son had asked the question, but it was clear she was hearing something she too needed to hear. "I remember sitting in her house after the funeral," the president continued, his voice quieter now, as if he were reliving the memory. "I found her old Bible on the coffee table. It was worn, the pages yellowed from years of use. She had scribbled notes in the margins, thoughts, prayers, little reminders to herself. I didn't know why, but I started flipping through it, looking for something. I didn't even know what I was looking for." He paused, letting the memory settle in the room. The boy didn't move, his eyes wide as he hung on every word. And then I found it, the president said, his voice breaking slightly. Next to a verse about faith, she had written, God is love, even when life isn't. A soft gasp escaped from someone in the audience. It wasn't just the words. It was the rawness of the moment that pierced through the stillness. I didn't understand it at first, he admitted, his gaze now distant, as though speaking to the memory itself. How could love exist in a world where someone like her could be taken away? How could I believe in a God who let that happen? But over time, I started to see what she meant. She wasn't saying that life would always be fair or easy or even kind. She was saying that love is what holds us together when life falls apart. The boy blinked rapidly, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. The audience was equally spellbound, their collective breath almost audible as they waited for what would come next. The president straightened slightly in his chair, his tone growing firmer. From that moment on, I stopped looking for God in the sky or in some perfect version of life. I started looking for God in the love people show each other, in the courage to keep going, in the kindness of strangers, in the little things we do for one another that remind us we're not alone. The boy's lips trembled, and for a moment, it looked as though he might cry. But he didn't. He simply nodded, the smallest of gestures, yet one that carried the weight of his understanding. The president smiled faintly, leaning forward again. Does that make sense to you? The boy hesitated before nodding again, this time more confidently. His hands relaxed their grip on the microphone stand, but questions like his don't just seek answers. They open doors to the parts of ourselves we often keep hidden. And in that room, every person felt a piece of their own heart laid bare. The president's voice grew steadier as he continued, though his words carried the weight of someone revisiting deeply personal memories. The room seemed to lean in collectively, each person hanging on his every word. For a long time, he said, looking directly at the boy, I thought faith was about having all the answers. I thought people who believed in God somehow knew something the rest of us didn't. But I've come to realize that faith isn't about certainty. It's about trust. Trusting in the love we give and receive, even when life feels impossible. The boy tilted his head slightly, his brow furrowed in thought, and the president offered a gentle smile. Let me tell you another story, he said, glancing briefly at the audience before returning his gaze to the boy. A few years ago, I met a woman in Michigan. She was a single mother, raising 2 kids on her own. She'd been through more than most of us can imagine. She'd lost her husband in a car accident, lost her job shortly after, and was barely making ends meet. Yet, every night, she'd sit with her kids and pray, not for miracles, not for money, but for strength. Just enough strength to get through one more day. The boy's eyes widened slightly, his lips parted as he listened. Around the room, heads nodded subtly. This wasn't just her story. It was the story of so many who had faced life's hardships with nothing but grit and faith to carry them forward. I asked her once, the president continued, how she kept going, how she managed to hold her family together when everything around her seemed to be falling apart. And do you know what she told me? He paused, looking directly at the boy again. Faith, she said, isn't waiting for someone to save you. It's knowing you have the strength to save yourself, and believing that God gave you that strength for a reason. The room seemed to collectively inhale, the weight of her words settling like a blanket over the audience. The president's voice softened. That mother taught me more about faith than I ever learned in any church. She showed me that faith isn't about expecting life to be easy. It's about finding the courage to do hard things, to love deeply, and to keep going even when it feels like the world is against you. He shifted in his seat, his expression growing more introspective. I think a lot of us spend our lives searching for something, some sign, some proof that God is real. But what I've learned is that God isn't something you find. God is something you feel. It's in the way we show kindness to a stranger, the way we forgive someone who hurt us, the way we stand by the people we love even when it's hard. That's where I see God, in love and action, in the things we do every day that remind us we're not alone in this world. The boy's small hands gripped the edge of the podium again, but this time it wasn't out of fear. His eyes were fixed on the president, his expression a mix of wonder and understanding. "I'll be honest with you," the president continued, his voice dropping slightly. "There have been times in my life when I've doubted, when I've looked at the pain and suffering in the world and wondered if God was even there. But every time I felt that doubt, I've been reminded of the love people are capable of. Love isn't always big or flashy. Sometimes, it's as small as a smile or a helping hand. But it's real. And for me, that's enough proof of God." The audience was silent, save for the occasional sniffle or the rustling of someone shifting in their seat. Even those who hadn't come for anything more than curiosity now found themselves caught up in the depth of his words. The president leaned forward, his eyes locking on the boys once again. "You're young, but you've already asked a question that many people spend their whole lives trying to answer. And that's a gift. Never stop asking questions, never stop seeking, because that's how we grow. That's how we find the things that matter most." The boy nodded slowly, his small hands still gripping the podium, but his posture had shifted. He stood a little taller now, his shoulders less tense, his expression less uncertain. It was as if the president's words had given him permission to feel the weight of his question without being crushed by it. The room, too, seemed to exhale, the collective tension easing as the president leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted, his voice softer now, almost confessional. "No one does. But what I do know is this: God isn't just something we believe in. God is something we live. Every time we choose kindness over anger, every time we choose love over fear, every time we choose to keep going even when it feels impossible, that's where God is. That's where we find meaning. That's where we find hope." The boy's mother, seated a few rows back, wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. Her son's question had opened a door, not just for him, but for everyone in the room. The president's words had touched something deep within them, something that transcended politics, religion, and even the boundaries of age. It was a reminder of the shared humanity that connected them all, a reminder that no matter how different their lives might seem, they were all searching for the same things: love, hope, and a sense of belonging. The president stood then, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were carrying the weight of the moment with him. He stepped down from the stage, his polished shoes clicking softly against the wooden floor, and approached the boy. The room watched in silence as he knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "You're brave," he said, his voice low but clear. "Braver than most people I know. Asking questions like that takes courage, and I want you to know that your courage matters. It matters more than you can possibly understand right now." The boy blinked up at him, his round glasses catching the light. For a moment he seemed unsure of what to say, but then he nodded, his small face serious. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The president smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "No," he said, his voice steady. "Thank you for reminding us all what really matters." He stood then, giving the boy's shoulder a final squeeze before turning back to the audience. The room erupted into applause, but it wasn't the polite, measured clapping from earlier. This was something deeper, more heartfelt. It was the sound of people who had been moved, who had been reminded of something they had forgotten, something they needed to remember. As the applause died down, the president returned to the stage, but the energy in the room had shifted. The questions that followed were softer, more personal, as if the boy's question had opened a door that no one had realized was closed. An elderly man in a worn flannel shirt stood, his voice trembling as he asked about forgiveness. A young woman, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, spoke about her struggles with faith in the face of loss. Each question was met with the same thoughtful, heartfelt response, the president's words weaving a tapestry of hope and humanity that seemed to envelop the room. By the time the event ended, the sun had set, the windows of the community center darkening as the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. People lingered, reluctant to leave, their conversations quieter now, more reflective. The boy's mother approached the stage, her son's hand in hers, and thanked the president, her voice breaking as she spoke. He knelt down to the boy's level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're a brave young man," he said. "Never stop asking questions." As the crowd began to disperse, the president stood at the edge of the stage, watching as families and neighbors filed out into the night. The room, once filled with noise and energy, was now quiet, the folding chairs empty, the microphone silent. But the words spoken that evening lingered, echoing in the hearts of those who had been there, a reminder of the power of a single question and the profound answers it can inspire. The boy and his mother, now back in their modest home, sat at the kitchen table, a single lamp casting a warm glow over the room. The boy's small hands were wrapped around a mug of hot cocoa, his glasses slightly fogged from the steam. His mother watched him, her expression soft, her heart still full from the night's events. "Did you understand what the president said?" she asked gently, her voice breaking the quiet. The boy nodded, his eyes thoughtful behind his glasses. "I think so," he said slowly. "He said God is in the love we show each other. Like when you make me hot cocoa after a long day. Or when you hug me when I'm scared." His mother smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That's right," she said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. "And it's not just the big things. It's the little things too. Like when you help your friend at school or when you say thank you to the bus driver." The boy sipped his cocoa, his small face serious. "I think I get it," he said after a moment. "God isn't just in church. God is everywhere. In the good stuff and even in the hard stuff." His mother nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "Exactly," she said. "And it's up to us to keep looking for that love, even when things feel tough." Across town, the elderly man who had lost his son sat on his porch, a blanket draped over his shoulders. The night air was cool, but he didn't mind. He felt lighter than he had in months, as if a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted. He thought about the president's words, about the idea that God could be found in the love we give and receive. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to honor his son's memory by living with that kind of love. And in a small apartment on the other side of town, the young woman who had walked away from her faith sat on her couch, her phone in her hand. She scrolled through the photos she had taken that night, pausing on one of the president speaking, his face earnest, his hands gesturing as if to emphasize the importance of his words. She thought about what he had said about faith being about hope, not fear. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of curiosity, a desire to explore what faith might look like if it wasn't about rules or judgment, but about love and connection. The night had been a turning point for so many, a reminder that even in the midst of life's challenges, there is always love to be found. And as the stars twinkled faintly above, their light steady and unchanging, it was as if they were whispering a quiet truth, that no matter how dark the night may seem, the dawn will always come. And with it, the promise of new beginnings, of hope, and of the enduring power of love. If this story touched you, don't forget to share it with someone who could use a reminder of the power of love and connection. Let's keep these conversations alive, because in the end, it's the questions we ask and the love we share that truly define us.